When people first hear about the GIAC GSEC certification, they often imagine a mysterious, high-pressure test where you either know everything or you do not. But the reality is more practical and a lot more manageable once you understand what the exam is trying to measure. This episode is about removing uncertainty by turning the exam into something you can describe clearly, plan for realistically, and navigate with confidence. Most anxiety comes from vague fear, and vague fear is exactly what good information can replace. We will walk through what the exam experience is like, what scoring means in plain terms, what rules matter because they can surprise people, and how timing affects the choices you make while you are sitting there. Even if you already know the topics you need to learn, understanding the testing environment changes how you study and how you perform. The goal is not to obsess over trivia about the test, but to treat the exam as a system with inputs, constraints, and a predictable output. A useful way to think about the exam is that it is a controlled environment designed to evaluate whether you can recognize security concepts, reason about them, and choose correct actions or interpretations under time pressure. That means the exam is not a creativity contest, and it is not asking you to write essays or design perfect architectures from scratch. Instead, you will see questions that present a situation, a term, a small scenario, or a technical detail, and your job is to select the best answer among the options given. The multiple-choice format is important because it changes how mistakes happen. You are not usually failing because you cannot explain something at all, but because two options look plausible and you miss the tiny difference that makes one of them more correct. That is why understanding how questions are structured matters. Many questions are designed to test discrimination between similar ideas, like encryption versus hashing, authentication versus authorization, or detection versus prevention, rather than testing whether you have memorized a dictionary definition. Now let's make the idea of scoring feel less mysterious, because people often treat scoring like a hidden judgment, when it is really just a measurement system. The exam produces a score based on how many items you answer correctly, and there is a defined passing standard that you must meet or exceed. You should not treat every question as equally emotionally important while you are taking the exam, because the score does not care how stressed you felt when you clicked an answer. In a practical sense, scoring is about consistency across a broad set of topics, not perfection in a narrow slice. You will likely encounter questions that hit your weakest areas on purpose, because the exam covers a wide range of security fundamentals. The healthiest mindset is to aim for steady competence and avoid catastrophic errors caused by rushing, second-guessing, or getting stuck on a single question that burns too much time. It also helps to internalize that the exam is a timed performance, and time is a resource you spend, not a punishment you endure. You are given a fixed amount of time to answer a fixed number of questions, which creates an average pace you need to maintain. Even if you do not calculate your pace down to the minute, your brain benefits from knowing that you cannot treat every item like a research project. Some questions will be fast because they test a clear concept you know well, while others will be slow because they require careful reading or a multi-step mental check. Timing strategy is really about reducing waste. Waste shows up when you reread the same question 5 times without changing your understanding, when you chase a detail that is not necessary, or when you let anxiety turn a simple question into a complicated one. A calm pace with deliberate choices usually beats frantic speed or perfectionist paralysis. The rules of the testing environment matter because they shape what you can rely on and what you should not expect. A basic example is that you should expect a standardized testing interface with tools like navigation between questions, the ability to mark items for review, and a visible clock showing remaining time. You should not expect to have access to the open internet, personal notes that are not allowed, or external resources outside the approved environment. The rule set exists to ensure fairness and to protect the integrity of the credential, and whether or not you like the rules, the smart move is to treat them as non-negotiable constraints. A good exam day plan includes knowing what identification you need, what the check-in process looks like, and what behaviors can trigger problems, like using prohibited devices or failing to follow proctor instructions. When people run into trouble, it is often not because they lack knowledge, but because they assume the environment would be flexible in ways it is not. Another practical angle is understanding what the exam is trying to prevent through its rules, because that helps you remember them under stress. Many policies are designed to prevent unauthorized access to exam content and to verify that the person taking the exam is the registered candidate. That can lead to strict identification requirements, controlled workspace requirements, and limitations on what you can have within reach. If the exam is proctored, the proctor's job is not to intimidate you, but to ensure that the conditions meet the standard. That means simple things like clearing your desk, keeping your eyes on the screen, and not talking out loud can matter more than you expect, especially for people who like to think verbally. If you know you have habits like reading questions aloud or pacing while thinking, you need to plan for how to stay comfortable while still complying with the environment. The more predictable you make your behavior, the less cognitive load you waste on non-content issues. Let's talk about the way questions can be written, because format is not only about multiple choice, it is also about the shape of the prompt. Some questions are direct, asking you to identify a term, a concept, or a best practice. Others are indirect, describing a situation and asking what is most likely happening, what the best next step is, or which control is most appropriate. For beginners, the hardest ones are often the questions that include extra details that feel important but are actually distractions. Exam writers do this because real security work includes noise, and a security professional must learn to separate signal from clutter. One skill that improves your score quickly is identifying the core of the question by asking yourself what decision is being requested. Is it asking you to choose a control type, identify an attack, select a risk response, or interpret a protocol behavior? Once you name the decision, many options become easier to eliminate. Elimination is a major exam skill, and it directly connects to timing and scoring. You do not need to be 100% certain of the perfect answer to improve your odds. You need to avoid obviously wrong answers, and then compare the remaining candidates carefully. This is where understanding common traps matters. A classic trap is when two answers are both true statements in general, but only one matches the question's context or goal. Another trap is when an answer uses strong absolute language like always or never, which is sometimes correct, but often a clue that the option is too rigid for a security context. A third trap is when an answer is technically correct, but at the wrong layer, such as offering an encryption solution to a problem that is actually about access control policy. When you practice, you should practice not only content recall, but also the habit of explaining to yourself why the wrong answers are wrong, because that builds discrimination. Now let's make timing feel concrete by connecting it to a simple decision loop you can use during the exam. Each question should pass through 3 phases: understand, decide, move on. Understand means you read the prompt carefully enough to know what is being asked, not just what words are present. Decide means you choose an answer based on the best reasoning you can apply within a reasonable time limit. Move on means you commit and do not repeatedly reopen the question unless you have a specific reason, like you marked it because you are missing one key idea. People who struggle with timing often get stuck between decide and move on, rereading and second-guessing without gaining new insight. A healthy approach is to set a personal threshold. If you cannot justify changing your answer with a new piece of reasoning, you do not change it. You can still mark it for review, but you preserve time for the rest of the exam, which protects your overall score. It is also worth talking about mental fatigue, because timing is not only about minutes and seconds, it is about attention. A long exam forces you to manage your focus, and beginners often underestimate how much concentration can drift after a sustained period of reading. This is why pacing includes micro resets, like briefly relaxing your shoulders, taking a slow breath, and recentering your attention before starting the next question. Those tiny resets can prevent careless mistakes that come from scanning instead of reading. Fatigue also increases the likelihood that you will misread a negative, like a question asking which option is not true or which control would be least effective. When your brain is tired, it tends to skip those small words, and that is where points disappear. A simple habit that helps is to restate the question in your own words before looking at the options, especially when it includes a qualifier like best, first, most likely, or least likely. Another part of decoding the exam is separating what is tested from what is merely interesting. The exam is built around core security knowledge across multiple domains, and it expects you to be able to connect concepts rather than memorize isolated facts. That means you should expect questions that require you to understand relationships, like how authentication supports access control, how logging supports detection and response, or how network protocols influence attack surface. It also means you should not expect the exam to reward deep vendor-specific knowledge or highly specialized implementation details, because the credential is about broad foundational security understanding. If you have a background in a specific tool or platform, that can help you imagine examples, but the test is not trying to see whether you have used that tool. This is good news for beginners, because it means you can focus on learning principles, common patterns, and basic technical behaviors, which are teachable in a structured way. Rules and timing also connect to what you bring into the exam environment, and even when policies vary by testing delivery method, the mindset should be the same. Control your variables. That means you sleep, you eat, you hydrate, and you set up your environment, so the only hard part is the questions. You do not want your first surprise to be a technical issue, a check-in delay, or a forgotten requirement that creates stress before you even start. If the exam is delivered in a proctored environment, you want to treat the start of the session like a pre-flight checklist. Everything ready, nothing extra, no frantic last-minute searching. If the exam is delivered at a test center, you want to know your travel plan, arrival time buffer, and what personal items will be stored away. When you reduce uncertainty in logistics, you preserve cognitive energy for the content, which is what actually produces points. Let's also address a common misconception about rules and scoring, which is the idea that the exam is trying to trick you. The better way to view it is that the exam is trying to distinguish between levels of understanding, and that distinction can feel like trickery when you are new. When you see two similar answers, it is not usually because the exam wants you to fail, but because it wants to know whether you understand the boundary between two concepts. For example, you might see a situation that sounds like encryption is the answer, but the real issue is key management or authentication. That is not a trick. It is a test of whether you can identify the actual weak link. The good news is that boundaries can be learned. You can train yourself to look for what the question is really measuring by paying attention to the verbs in the prompt, like prevent, detect, validate, authorize, encrypt, or audit, because verbs reveal the expected type of control or action. A final layer of timing strategy is knowing how to use review effectively without turning it into a second full exam. The point of marking items for review is to capture uncertainty quickly, keep moving, and then return later with a fresh mind and extra time. The wrong way to use review is to mark half the exam and then panic at the end, because you have created a second workload you cannot complete. A smarter approach is to mark only questions where you can name exactly what is missing, such as one definition, one protocol behavior, or one distinction between two models. When you return, you should aim to resolve those items fast, not reopen the entire reasoning process from scratch. You are not trying to achieve perfect certainty. You are trying to avoid preventable mistakes. Review should be a targeted cleanup pass, not a full rewrite of your choices. As you wrap up your understanding of format, scoring, rules, and timing, the biggest win is realizing that the exam is a solvable problem with a predictable structure, not a mysterious gatekeeper. The content matters most, but the environment and the constraints shape how your knowledge translates into a score. When you know what the exam experience feels like, you stop wasting mental energy on surprise and start investing that energy into careful reading, steady pacing, and disciplined decision-making. Your goal on exam day is not to prove you are a genius, but to demonstrate consistent understanding across a broad field of security fundamentals under reasonable pressure. If you treat time like a budget, treat rules like fixed constraints, and treat each question like a small decision that must be made and then released, you give your knowledge the best chance to show up clearly. That is what decoding the exam really means, turning uncertainty into a plan you can execute calmly, one question at a time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.